A Huey comes back from a mission with 23 bullet holes, a cracked rotor blade, hydraulic fluid leaking everywhere, and engine oil pressure dropping. The pilot says it barely made it back, and your job is to have that helicopter ready to fly again in 6 hours, because there are soldiers out there who need it. This is what it meant to be a helicopter mechanic in Vietnam. And this is why those mechanics were some of the most important and most underappreciated people in the entire war. This isn't about the glory of flying. This isn't about combat missions. This is about the guys who kept the Hueys flying, the mechanics, the crew chiefs, the specialists who worked 18-hour days in brutal conditions to maintain aircraft that were being shot to pieces daily. Without these guys, the helicopters don't fly. And if the helicopters don't fly, soldiers die. This is their story, and it's one that doesn't get told nearly enough. Let me start with what a typical maintenance inspection looked like. Every single day, every Huey had to go through a detailed pre-flight inspection, even if the aircraft hadn't flown the previous day, even if it looked fine. You inspected everything because missing something could kill an entire crew. You'd start with the rotor blades. Walk around the aircraft examining each of the 2 main rotor blades for any signs of damage, cracks, dents, delamination, battle damage. The rotor blades were made of aluminum and honeycomb material. They were strong but not indestructible. A crack in a rotor blade that wasn't caught could cause catastrophic failure mid-flight. The blade could separate from the rotor head. The helicopter would become uncontrollable. Everyone would die. Then you'd check the rotor head itself, the hub where the blades attach. This component took enormous stress, the centrifugal forces when the rotors were spinning, the vibrations, the constant loading and unloading. You'd look for cracks in the metal, check the bolts, make sure everything was tight, make sure nothing was worn beyond limits. Next was the tail rotor. This was critical. If the tail rotor failed, the helicopter lost directional control. It would spin. There's no recovering from that. So you'd inspect the tail rotor blades, check the gearbox that drove them, look for any play in the bearings, any unusual sounds when you manually spun the blades, anything that seemed off. The engine inspection was detailed. The Huey used a Lycoming T53 turbine engine, about 1,100 horsepower depending on the variant. You'd check the engine mounts, look for cracks or loose bolts, check all the fluid levels, oil, hydraulic fluid, fuel. Look for leaks. Even small leaks could indicate bigger problems. You'd inspect the exhaust for cracks, check the air intake for blockages or damage. The transmission was another critical component. The transmission took power from the engine and transferred it to the rotor system. It was complex and under enormous stress. You check the transmission mounts, listen for unusual sounds, check the oil level and condition, look for metal shavings in the oil that would indicate internal wear or damage. The hydraulic system needed constant attention. The Huey had hydraulics that assisted with flight controls. Without hydraulics, the controls became extremely heavy and difficult to move. You'd check hydraulic fluid levels, inspect all the lines for leaks or damage, check the hydraulic pumps, test the system pressure. Any issues with hydraulics had to be fixed immediately. The fuel system inspection included checking the fuel tanks for leaks, inspecting fuel lines, checking fuel filters for contamination, making sure the fuel cap sealed properly. Fuel leaks in a combat zone were especially dangerous. Tracer rounds could ignite leaking fuel, turn a survivable hit into a catastrophic fire. And all of this was just the daily inspection. This didn't include checking the instruments, the radios, the electrical systems, the flight controls, the landing gear. Every single system on the aircraft had to be inspected, and this inspection had to be completed before the first mission of the day. Usually meant mechanics were starting work at 0400 or 0500 in the morning. Now, let me explain why Vietnam made all of this exponentially harder. The conditions in Vietnam were absolutely brutal on helicopters. The environment actively tried to destroy these aircraft. The heat was a major problem. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity. This affected everything. Engines ran hotter. Components expanded differently than they did in normal temperatures. Seals and gaskets deteriorated faster. Hydraulic fluid thinned out. Everything wore out quicker than it should have. The dust was a nightmare. Vietnam had red dust that got into everything. This dust was incredibly fine, almost like powder, and it was abrasive. When helicopters landed or took off, they kicked up massive dust clouds. This dust got sucked into engines, into transmissions, into bearings, into every moving part. The air filters would clog daily, sometimes multiple times per day during dry season. The engine air filters on a Huey in normal conditions might last weeks or months. In Vietnam, they lasted hours. You'd change air filters constantly. And if you didn't stay on top of it, the engine would ingest dust. The dust would wear out turbine blades, cause compressor damage, reduce engine performance, eventually cause engine failure. The dust also got into the transmission, into the gearboxes, mixed with the oil and created an abrasive slurry that wore out gears and bearings much faster than normal. You'd check transmission oil and see it was contaminated with dust. You'd have to drain it, clean the system, refill with fresh oil. This happened constantly. Then there was the jungle itself. Helicopters often flew through areas with vegetation. Tree branches would hit rotor blades. Vines would wrap around landing gear. The jungle was trying to pull these aircraft down. You'd find damage from vegetation strikes regularly. Dents in leading edges, scratches and gouges, sometimes more serious damage that required blade replacement. And of course, there was combat damage. This was the biggest challenge. Hueys were getting shot constantly. Bullet holes, shrapnel damage, damage from explosions. Every mission could bring back an aircraft that was shot to pieces. A single bullet hole in the skin wasn't critical unless it hit something important. But Hueys were taking dozens of hits, sometimes hundreds. You'd have helicopters come back looking like Swiss cheese, and every single hole had to be inspected. You had to determine if the bullet hit anything critical, if it went through a structural component, if it damaged hydraulic lines or fuel lines or electrical wiring. The repairs were often done in the field. You didn't have the luxury of sending the helicopter to a depot. You fixed it right there on the flight line with whatever tools and materials you had available. Bullet holes in non-critical areas got patched with aluminum patches, riveted or bonded in place. Hydraulic lines that were damaged got replaced. Electrical wires that were cut got spliced and repaired. All of this while the next mission was already being planned. The most challenging repairs were the ones done at remote fire bases. Sometimes helicopters would get damaged and barely make it to a fire base instead of making it all the way back to the main base, and you'd have to go out there to fix it. Pack your tools, pack whatever parts you thought you might need, load onto another helicopter and fly out to the fire base. Working at a fire base was difficult. You had limited tools, limited parts, limited space, and you were working in a combat zone. The fire base could take mortar fire or small arms fire while you were working. You learned to work fast, get the aircraft flyable as quickly as possible. Sometimes you couldn't fix it properly. You did a field repair that would get the helicopter back to the main base where you could do it right. There's a story from 1968.
A Huey took heavy damage during a medevac mission. Multiple hits. One went through the transmission. The helicopter made an emergency landing at a small fire base. The crew chief looked at the damage and thought the aircraft was done. But there were wounded soldiers at another location that needed evacuation, and no other helicopters available. The crew chief and another mechanic who flew out to help decided to try something. They couldn't replace the transmission, but they could patch the hole and add transmission fluid. It wouldn't be a permanent fix. Might last an hour, might last 5 minutes, but it was worth trying. They patched the hole with a piece of metal and sealant, filled the transmission with every bit of spare oil they could find. The pilot did a test hover. Transmission temperature was climbing, but it was holding. They decided to try. Flew the mission, got the wounded out, brought them back. The transmission held, barely, but it held. That kind of improvisation saved lives. Part shortages were a constant problem. The military supply system couldn't keep up with the demand. Hueys were being damaged faster than parts could be shipped in, so mechanics had to improvise. Cannibalize parts from aircraft that were too damaged to fly. Trade parts with other units. Make do with what they had.
There's a famous saying among Huey mechanics: if it looks stupid but works, it's not stupid. That philosophy defined a lot of field repairs, using wire and duct tape and whatever else was available to keep helicopters flying. Officially, these weren't approved repairs, but when soldiers need evacuation and you don't have the right parts, you make it work. One common improvisation involved rotor blades. If a blade was damaged but not critically, mechanics would sometimes trim the damage and rebalance the rotor system. Officially, damaged blades were supposed to be replaced, but replacement blades weren't always available. So you'd carefully cut away the damaged portion, fill it with epoxy or resin, sand it smooth, then rebalance the rotor by adding weights to the opposite blade. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Fuel leaks were another area where mechanics had to improvise. The approved repair for a leaking fuel tank was to remove and replace it, but that could take days, and helicopters were needed immediately. So mechanics would patch leaks with sealant, use epoxy compounds designed for fuel tanks, apply layers of fiberglass, whatever it took to stop the leak long enough to get the aircraft back in service. The workload was brutal. Mechanics were working 18-hour days regularly. Aircraft would come back from missions shot up. You'd work all night to get them ready for morning missions. As soon as you finished one helicopter, another would come in needing work. The cycle never stopped. And you were working in terrible conditions. The heat, the humidity, the dust. Working outside on a flight line with minimal shade. Wearing heavy work clothes because you needed protection. Sweat pouring off you constantly. Dehydration was a real problem. Heat exhaustion was common. The tools you had were basic. Hand tools mostly. Wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, some specialized tools for specific jobs, but nothing fancy. You made it work with what you had. Sometimes you had to fabricate tools, modify existing tools, get creative. The danger was real too. You were working in a combat zone. The base could take mortar or rocket fire at any time. You learned to work with one eye on your helicopter and one eye on the surroundings, ready to dive for cover if you heard incoming. And there was always the pressure, the knowledge that if you missed something, people could die. If you didn't catch a crack in a rotor blade, if you didn't properly secure a bolt, if you made a mistake, that weight sat on every mechanic's shoulders. You checked and double-checked everything because you couldn't afford to be wrong. Despite all of this, the Hueys kept flying. The maintenance crews kept them in the air through sheer determination and skill. The operational readiness rates for Hueys in Vietnam were actually impressive given the conditions. A significant percentage of the fleet was flyable at any given time, and that was entirely because of the mechanics. These guys saved lives just as surely as the pilots and crew members. Every wounded soldier who was evacuated flew in a helicopter that a mechanic had kept running. Every troop insertion, every supply mission, every combat operation, all of it depended on mechanics doing their jobs perfectly under impossible conditions. There are countless stories of mechanics going above and beyond, working through the night to get aircraft ready, risking their lives to repair helicopters at forward bases under fire, making repairs that shouldn't have been possible with the resources available. All of it done without recognition or glory, just the satisfaction in knowing they kept their birds flying. The bond between mechanics and flight crews was strong. The crews trusted the mechanics with their lives. The mechanics felt responsible for keeping the crews safe. If a crew came back and reported an issue, mechanics took it seriously. They knew that weird sound or unusual vibration could be the warning sign of something critical. Many mechanics developed deep connections with specific aircraft. They'd maintain the same helicopters mission after mission, know every quirk, every tendency. They could diagnose problems by sound, by feel. They knew when something wasn't right, even if they couldn't immediately identify the problem. That institutional knowledge was invaluable. By the end of their tours, these mechanics had kept dozens of helicopters flying, had performed thousands of repairs, had worked countless hours under terrible conditions. They came home with skills that translated to civilian aviation. Many became civilian helicopter mechanics, A&P mechanics. Some started their own aviation businesses. But they also came home with injuries, back problems from years of heavy physical labor, hearing loss from working around running engines without proper protection, respiratory issues from inhaling dust and fumes. The physical toll was real and permanent. The Huey mechanics of Vietnam deserve recognition as some of the unsung heroes of the war. They didn't fly the missions, they didn't get the glory, but without them, none of it would have been possible. Every helicopter that flew, every life that was saved, every mission that was completed, it all started with a mechanic who made sure that aircraft was ready to fly. When you see footage of Hueys in Vietnam, remember that behind every one of those helicopters was a crew of mechanics who kept it flying, who worked through the night, who improvised solutions to impossible problems, who refused to let their birds stay grounded. Those mechanics were the backbone of helicopter operations in Vietnam, and they made the difference between success and failure, between life and death.